Hello, and welcome to World Water Week. Bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, or otherwise known as BECCS, are promoted as examples of negative carbon emission technologies allowing for the long-term removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. But does their contribution to carbon neutrality come at the cost of water resources, land use, and biodiversity? In today's discussion, we're taking a closer look and a critical eye to BECCS and their suitability as a solution for carbon sequestration. For this discussion, I'm joined by Geoffrey Lapillus, Program Officer for Water and Climate at the French Water Partnership, Dr. Charles Scaife, Energy Water Resilience Lead for the U.S. Department of Energy, and Dr. Stefan Uhlenbrück, Director Hydrology, Water, and Cryosphere from the World Meteorological Organization. Very welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. I think it's a really fascinating topic and a timely discussion. So, Geoffrey, I'd like to start with you. For their audience members who don't know, and I think many of us don't know, can you tell us a little bit more about BECCS and why their implementation might be concerning for water resources management?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I will start maybe to introduce a bit of context about why we talk about BECCS today and why the French Water Partnership released a report on BECCS. Basically, the French Water Partnership is a platform for all French water stakeholders that are operating at the international level, public, private, non-governmental. Our main missions are to facilitate international exchanges on the French know-how and also advocating for mainstreaming water in international sustainable development policies as well as processes. So we have a working group on water and climate and a dedicated task force on the water energy nexus. So in that space, we are advocating for looking at climate mitigation measures, not only through the lens of carbon emissions, but taking a global SDGs approach, taking other impacts into account, including on water. That is why we partnered up with EDF, Electricity of France, as well as other partners, to work more closely on BECCS. So BECCS stands for, as you said, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. This technology is part of all IPCC scenarios to remain within the boundary of plus 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And in a nutshell, BECCS is basically the use of biomass as an energy source, coupled with a unit to capture, compress, and transport the CO2 generated to organize its geological storage. Mm-hmm. So in our synthesis, we identified three major potential limits to the development of BECCS at scale, which are economic viability, social viability, and environmental viability. On this last environmental part, and especially on water, there is, on the one hand, the production of biomass for BECCS with additional pressure on land use and land management to grow, for instance, energy crops, which might, in some cases, result in the conversion of freshwater ecosystems. For example, forest, wetlands, grasslands, etc. And on the other hand, there is direct risks of pollution of surface and groundwater with the chemicals used by the industrial process. Mm. So we see it's really linked with water management, mm-hmm. and that and with talking about this subject, we try to reach to policymakers and especially climate policymakers, mm-hmm. to take into account those externalities other than the good externalities on carbon.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, very interesting, and particularly I didn't understand the implication of the biomass production, and I think that's a really, it's a huge water pressure there, and so many different stakeholders to bring into that conversation. So it sounds like it's a very fitting role for the French Water Partnership to be part of. Thank you so much for that. Charles, I'd like to move to you. In your experience, what trade-offs do we need to focus on when it comes comes to these types of water and energy policies?
Yeah, thank you, Kanika, and thanks, Joffrey, for that background. I think this is a really challenging sort of question to start with, and I think a good place to sort of start is maybe building off of something that Joffrey mentioned and thinking about scale. I work at the U.S. Department of Energy, and there we focus on everything from basic science research, so thinking about advancing models and examining ecosystem processes and the built environment, to thinking about new technologies that we can start to deploy at scale. And one of the things that I've found that's been really difficult sort of working in this innovation space has been sort of the silo of information, right? We often think about energy or we think about water, and it's not often that we're thinking about them as integrated issues. And I think, by and large, a big contribution to sort of this siloing is how we talk about scale. And that could be things like spatial scale or even sort of temporal scale, so thinking about how these things like energy and water change with time. An example of this scale is, if you think about how we talk about water, we're often thinking about, at a spatial level, watersheds or perhaps regions. So, how is climate impacting, water within a particular region? But when we think about energy and have discussions on energy about scale, we often think about perhaps building efficiencies or efficiencies within communities. And then we sort of jump to grid or even sort of country policies. And so that really, I think, sets us up for not having a good discussion and research environment around these trade-offs between energy and water. I think one of our challenges in this framework is really reconciling these two things. And so being able to identify a problem that we're trying to address regarding energy and water really requires us starting with scale. And so I think this really touches on sort of Joffrey's point. BECCS are associated with sort of growing biomass, as Joffrey mentioned, and one of the big trade-offs when we think about scale is really how we're trading CO2 footprint for water footprint, right? So we may be reducing CO2 emissions, but we have to think about sort of that trade-off with water. And that becomes really tricky in places that are dry, right? So think about the Western US or the desert Southwest of the United States. And so, to Joffrey's point, these shifts in sort of land use, land cover change can shift water quality and water quantity. So, some very complex trade-offs, but we really need to start with how do we define the spatial scale of these issues?
It was very interesting, a very relevant point you're raising there. I mean, these are not small things that we're talking about. These are enormous, and we talk about the energy demand that the world is looking at, especially as we move more towards a data-driven world that requires a lot more energy as well. Let me come back to what you're talking about in terms of these silos and the water silo and the energy silo. So within the U.S. context, do you foresee any future opportunity to bridge these silos, bring them together when it comes to BECCS? What is that future when it comes to the energy water nexus with regards to BECCS?
That is a fabulous question, and quite literally one of the reasons I'm here today. At the U.S. Department of Energy, I'm leading our energy water resilience and really thinking about how do we bring these two silos together so that we can think about challenges related to BECCS. I would say that this is a pretty sort of big blind spot for the U.S. Department of Energy and even the U.S. more broadly. And so, we've been talking to our agency partners across the federal government to understand some of these issues at the nexus of energy and water. And I think that the future is really positive. We're moving in a really important direction, but there's a lot of work to get started on.
Okay, so I'm taking for it's positive, but there's a long way to go. So we'll be staying tuned and watching what comes next. Stefan, I'd love to come to you now. The UN Water Expert Group on Climate Change recently published a report that estimates that the global freshwater requirements for climate mitigation they recently put out the estimate for those global freshwater requirements for climate mitigation measures. What is that global need for water considering the expected development of BECCS? How much water are we going to need in order to achieve this goal?
A lot of water, huh? In a nutshell. And I think it's a contribution to walk along that path he was talking about. There's a long way to go, and I think with this global assessment, we made a step in that direction. So what the UN Water Expert Group together, and all the technical work has been actually done by the International University Alliance for Climate Change, led by University of New South Wales in Australia. They did all the late data crunching and all the heavy lifting for this report. And what we did there, what the experts did, is kind of trying to understand if we transition to a more renewable pathway from our energy supply sources, how much water does it cost? And I think it's really some exciting results. And they looked at when we want to stay in the 1.5 degree warming. WMO data and many other data shows that we are actually rather quickly exceeding that limit, but maybe a short time, we don't know. But if we want to stay in that safe operating space at 1.5 degree, which is a challenge, then what does it mean in terms of moving to nuclear, moving to wind and solar, moving to bioenergy, geothermal, etc., and how much water does it cost? And in a nutshell, what came out of that, wind and solar is kind of not so thirsty, and among the more thirsty components of that energy transition certainly is biofuel, and therefore even BECCS, so bioenergy, even with carbon capture and storage, is a thirsty form of energy. And BECCS, it's actually also a German beer company, but it's really I'm speaking about BECCS here from the bioenergy, and it is thirsty. What was estimated by the expert first to grow the biomass globally in this scenario, staying within 1.5 degree, it's kind of 640 cubic kilometer per year, and another 400 for the carbon capture and storage. It's on the global scale very significant. However, all these global numbers, I need to say, are quite uncertain. All our estimates have a significant limitation, uncertainties which are properly discussed, and it's not the global water demand that necessarily drives the decision. As Jeffrey also said, it's often a local decision that needs to be taken, and BECCS can be a very important part of the solution if locally, nationally, or regionally the necessary water and land resources are available to do that, and are not competing with other objectives, including biodiversity, food security, other energy aspects. And so it's kind of a complex equation, as also Charles stressed. But with this report, we made a step in that direction, I believe.
No, I hear very much from you, and also from Charles, that this can be contextual, right? That there might be many solutions, many situations, like you mentioned, in the drier parts of the U.S. where this is not going to work. But there could absolutely be potentially areas where it might be very suited. So it's not a blanket solution, but it could be right in the right context. Thank you so much, Geoffrey. I'd like to come back to you. You have, I think we've talked a lot about water and under the umbrella of SDG 6, which is very, fitting. We are at World Water Week, but it seems as though there are definitely impacts to other SDGs. So tell me, have you had a chance to look at that, and what might those impacts be?
Yeah, actually, in our synthesis report, we looked at impacts on other SDGs, like in the Agenda 2030 kind of wholeful way of looking at things, and actually there is both positive impact and negative impact, and it's once again context dependent, as we said. So for instance, of course, like SDG 6 on water, SDG 7 on energy are impacted for this, but it's also like SDG 2 on hunger, which is like the crops and the land viability. It's also SDG 15 on life on land, biodiversity, that can be impacted and especially negatively impacted by this technology. But on the positive impact can be also SDG 9 on industry. That is if BECCS developed, maybe other industry can also use CCS, such as cement industry or other, heavy industry. And my last example would be also the SDG sustainable cities, because maybe if we, dispose of our organic waste and feed it to the BECCS plant, then it's a way of circular economy. So it's there is impacts on other SDGs, and we believe at the French Water Partnership, but a lot of people in World Water Week believe also that it's really like a systemic view we have to take on things, and with all SDGs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's so critically important. We're not just after achieving one SDG, we're after achieving all, but so it has to be done in that balance. So, and there are trade-offs, as you said. We might be better serving some SDGs than others when we apply these approaches, but as we've also touched on earlier, that context is super important. Thank you so much. The conversation we're having today, I mean, it's really shining that really important light on the integration of water and energy policy. And so I'm really curious to ask all of you, what do you think this policy future looks like? We've heard a little bit from Charles in terms of what it looks like for the U.S., but I think there's a huge diversity of landscapes out there. So I'm curious, what do you think the policy future looks like, and really importantly, who needs to be involved, who needs to be part of that conversation? So maybe Stefan, I'm going to ask you to start.
Who needs to be involved is clear. We also a lot of decisions about land and water are done at local scale, so therefore subnational local institutions need to be involved in that discussion, including public as well as private sector, and the representation of civil society is critical to involve in that decision. Local authorities, we need targeted finance for that. I think that's critical to really fuel renewable in a renewable way, fuel that machinery, and as I said before, I believe because there's different less water intense solutions. I'm not saying that BECCS is necessarily a bad idea. Not at all. It can be the right thing, but there's less water intense options in the energy mix, including wind and solar connected with pump storage. We need to understand better at the localized context, as you said. Which mix of energy sources is the best for the given problem. There's not a single answer to that, and to develop that right solution or the right strategy for a given region, country, subnational, municipality, it needs these stakeholders, and it needs a very contextualized, specific analysis of the problem and developing the solution with all the stakeholders.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Charles, I'll ask you to quickly come in. I know you've already touched on this a little bit. If there's anything that you'd like to drive home on that point.
I think you're going to get the same answer that Stefan just said. I mean, what I always tell people is that energy-water nexus is a really sticky issue, right? It touches on just about everything. And I think, kind of summarizing some of what we're all talking about is that we really need to have a paradigm shift on how we think about systems, energy and water systems. And so, and part of that paradigm shift means bringing communities to the table. These solutions are going to be very context specific. And so without those communities, I don't know that we'll really meet those energy and water goals that we're after.
Wonderful. I mean, I'm always happy to hear about wanting to bring more communities to the table. So now we just need to make sure it happens. Yeah. Geoffrey, who do we need to bring to the table?
Maybe because I don't want to repeat. maybe to talk about on the international agenda, and we see like French stakeholders are talking about it and try to act upon it. US as well, and then the UN Water Expert Group on Climate Change report hopefully build momentum on the international policy agenda, so that in the next events and negotiations that we have, COP29, COP30, the UN 26 Water Conference, that we can make sure to have including in our water talks, energy people that is currently missing, and that's for me important, but energy as well as other sectors, of course.
Absolutely. I'd like to thank you, all three of you, Geoffrey, Charles, and Stefan, for joining this really important conversation today. I mean, I think we've had some really important points about needing to break through those silos, but also bringing everybody to the table, from communities all the way up to multilateral stakeholders, and making sure that we put this on the agenda of important stakeholder conferences like the 2026 UN Water Conference. So thank you so much. We're going to be keenly watching as you take these policy messages forward and into the future. And thank you so much, audience, for joining us today, both here in Stockholm and online. We'll see you next time.